going to talk to you about a recent piece of research looking particularly at Muslim young women in schools in Europe. But I want to start by questioning what do we mean by equity and engagement. And I know that all of you are involved in, as practitioners and academic researchers and so on, in looking at how do we create social change? How do we bring about change? How do we use our ideals and our philosophies and our thoughts and thinking about activism to bring about change? Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the business that we're in if we didn't want to bring about change. So what do we mean by equity and engagement? Well, the first question is, what do we mean by equity for different pupils in different challenging multicultural situations? And for me, as an educator, both at university level and also in schools, the question for me is the holy grail of equity and social justice issues. We need to ask these questions because as practitioners, we're troubled by the many complicated, confusing discourses around difference, identity, diversity, multiculturalism, social cohesion, assimilation, pluralism. It's all there in the ether, but we really don't know what it means. And it can mean such different things to each individual. You were saying that, Denise, earlier. And we need to unpack these discourses. And I think at the core of them is the question, do we teach all and treat all pupils the same? i.e., is equity the leveler, the idea that we have fair treatment, i.e., bring in laws and legislation around equal opportunities to ensure that there is equity and equal treatment, i.e., treating pupils the same. The law has this idea that we can remedy this negative prohibition around equality. So we bring in the law and we try to level out issues around sameness. But at the same time, our pupils are very different. Canada is as multicultural, I think, as the UK now, and you know, do we respect difference? Do we celebrate difference? How do we do that and treat all people the same? How do we have this idea of equity and sameness and difference at the same time? So these kind of discourses and where we position ourselves is really important for thinking through how do we, you know, form our principles and our ethos around what we do as academics, which is a second question that I bring up. How do we actually position ourselves? What are our principles of professional and academic engagement, and how do we arrive at them? One of my most favorite books is Helen Casey, I Answer With My Life. Has anyone read this amazing book? She does, you've read it, Elaine. It's a very powerful stories of different types of women who engage in education. There are Catholic nuns, Jewish educators, black women educators, amongst the groups that she collects these oral narratives from. And what she argues is that teachers are transformative agents, and how they transform, how they become engaged in their equity issues is through a process of theorizing through the active reciprocal relationships that they develop on the ground, in the grassroots situations that they actually find themselves in. So that they're not, you know, activists before they might have started, but through the process of teaching, learning, and being in those communities, they develop their ethical and philosophical positions. So for her, the oral narrative that they you know, espouse in the research, the oral histories, the stories that they tell, reveals the sites of struggle. So what happens is that the language that they use becomes the meaning. So through the changing language as educators, she can map their political discourses. And I urge you to read this book. It's quite old now, but I still think it has that essence of how we become reflexive agents, how we reflect on our own practice, and how our language changes as we develop. And then the final question about equity and engagement is, what social, political, and cultural change do we actually want to achieve? It's all right saying we want to be change agents, we believe in equity and social justice, but what about the consequences of our actions, and where does it take us? I'll give you an example. I'm doing some consultancy work with the very hallowed Marks and Spencers. Have you heard of Marks and Spencers? Yes, of course you have. And they've taken me on to help them think through how they're going to train women in their factories, and also women not even in their factories, the home workers that supply the factories in the so-called supply chain. And one of the things they want to do is develop better workers' rights, health education, literacy, financial planning for the women, and so on. So, you know, I drew up this very complex plan for them. And I said, are you prepared for what will happen if you empower these workers? What will they do? Ask for more money. I haven't heard from them since. You know, they've sort of parked the project for the moment. But, you know, this is the idea of social change. You know, we want to bring about change, but are we prepared for the actions? Paulo Freire, one of my also very favorite and very inspirational influences in my work, talks about the consciousization, the development of new intellectuals, and how these new intellectuals, again, make meaning through struggle, and how they come through the grassroots. And what he argues, it's the struggle that creates the agents and the new intellectual. And critical consciousness that brings about engagement is not a prerequisite for struggle, but it arises out of the critical engagement. So I think that activism is something that requires a theoretical framework. It just can't exist by feeling that you want to change, that you want to, you know, make a difference. That's all well and good. We have to actually problematize what we find out there, and we have to use research in that endeavor. So activism, for me, requires conceptual and analytical tools. I always remember when I did something called development studies in the 1970s, which was third world development. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, there's more information than you need to know, but he said, I want to change the world. I'm going to give up my degree and go out and, you know, dig rivers and plant potatoes in Africa and whatever. And he said to me, you can learn more you can change more by actually finishing your degree and having some influence. So, you know, activism does require that kind of analytical tools, theoretical frameworks. And so I'm going to take you on to looking at some of the findings of the study. Now, this was a study that was done with European partners. In Britain, we work across Europe. We have strong connections, as you know, with our Euro crisis, but we don't need to go there. And I worked with partners in Cyprus, Malta, Spain, and Greece, and we looked at the issue of migrant girls in schools. But what came up in our English studies, in looking at inner city urban schools, was the issues around young Muslim girls. It just kept popping out at us. And what we found were these main observations: that bullying was really rife in the school. And the girls complained and talked about this as the main issue that troubled them. And what really troubled me, as somebody that often looks at, you know, racism and discrimination, that this was black on black bullying, Muslim on Muslim bullying, boys on girls bullying. And so there wasn't that simple black-white racial divide, which reflects the kind of very complex post-structuralist kind of society that we live in now. We have this big debate whether we live in a post-race era, we have Obama in the White House and so on, that there's no longer gender inequality because somehow women have jobs, and yet there is more domestic violence and trafficked women than ever before. So, you know, we aren't free of the shackles of discrimination, but it's very complex now, very multi-layered. So we found that skin and beauty mattered a lot. Girls would be teased and bullied on the grounds of how they looked and what they were wearing. One of the Muslim girls from Burundi, she was wearing the full niqab, and she said that she wore that because she couldn't afford the clothes that the other trendy girls in the school would have. So it was a way of actually protecting her identity. So, and that was from the other Muslim girls as well, I mean, and the boys as well. So the complexity of race and gender bullying was something. Another thing that which he found was family and community surveillance was rife. And by that I mean they were watched, not only in school, but outside school in their wider community. Their behavior was regulated, who they were seeing, if they were meeting people after school. This regulation of their sexuality spilled over into their, like I said, into their own communities. So we had, for example, a young Afghani girl was saying that that this boy, who she didn't really know, but was from her own community, was waiting and watching and then going and telling her father if she talked to boys after school and so on. So there was this constant regulation of being watched. And everybody in the community was involved in it, mothers, sisters, brothers. Brothers were particularly involved in it. Then there was the regulation of dress. This was about wearing the veil. We went to an all-Muslim girls' school, as well as other schools that were more diverse, but with large populations of Muslim young people. And the veil, which I'm going to talk to you a bit more about, became this object that people really focused on. So you got the young women saying that often the teachers disrespected them for wearing the veil. They would say things like, in the Muslim girls-only school, they were talked about the way that the teachers said, take your veil off and it's really hot and we won't tell your parents, as if they were wearing the veil as a fashion thing. And they also, another girl said that the teacher told them to take the veil off, and there was some marking on the desk, some pen, and to wipe the desk clean with her veil. So there was this kind of disrespect, but at the same time there was also a kind of over-respecting of the veil amongst many teachers. And there was one white, middle-class, quite liberal teacher who was so concerned that these girls were wearing the headscarf, but with makeup and earrings, which she felt was anti-Islamic. And she wanted to police their behavior and say that they shouldn't, that they were disrespecting Islam and that they shouldn't be combining, you know, fashion with the headscarf. So there was a lot of regulation about what they wore and a focus on it as well. They also, and this is very interesting, had very high academic expectations and very high academic performance, particularly in the girls-only school. And they had expectations of going into what we call the Russell Group universities, the top layer, Oxford, Cambridge, King's, UCL, all the top universities in the UK. And this was very interesting because the Muslim girls' school was in the lowest, one of the poorest boroughs, areas, districts in London, with high rates of poverty, high levels of male unemployment, very large Bangladeshi community. And yet, they were actually achieving this. And how did they achieve this? Through what we call learning mentors. The school brought in mentors to help them bridge the cultural and social capital deficit that they had. Because they weren't middle class, they didn't know how to navigate the education system, how to apply for university. And so these learning mentors, which was brought by the head teacher, because she had a vision, and she actually pushed her budget towards bringing in these parent liaison officers, often people from the community, to help bridge this culture, what we call cultural capital gap for the young women. And she was able to do that because she didn't have behavior problems in the school, so she could vie the budget from the behavior, because the girls were very well behaved, to learning mentors. So the girls were, if you like, good girls, which is interesting. And then a shocking finding was the high rates of mental health issues amongst the young women. This is totally under-researched and under-spoken about. And there were, in a class, and these were girls mainly 16 to 19, what we call the sixth form, doing A-levels. What's the equivalent here? Sixth form? Grade 12. Grade 12. So that in a class with about 100 young people, we'd find about 12 to 15 young women with issues around depression, attempted suicide, and eating disorders. And what we found was that a lot of these evolved around some of the cliche issues that I struggle with as well, things like forced marriage, cultural, the surveillance, and so on. But we'll work through our analysis a little bit and how we need to understand these cultural issues in a way that doesn't pathologize those communities. You could say that one of the findings we found was that the services for these young women were lacking. And that was because the girls didn't go. They didn't know. There wasn't enough information in the school about what was going on. And they would go to a teacher that they trusted, not through the services. So, and they were also between adult and children. So they weren't in the children's services and they weren't in the adult services. So they would fall through the gap. And often when there was a mental health issue, they stopped coming to school. And because they were over 16, they'll just fall off the register. So there were lots of complications around those things. So those are just some of the findings and observations. But I want to talk to you about how then do we understand and develop our analysis to the next level. So a second observation, so not only did we have those school-based observations, but a second observation is the media frenzy with what we call the overdetermined Muslim women. How she is seen as a kind of an objectification, how she's seen as an object of discourse, how she is sort of given so much meaning to what she wears. This is what I mean by the overdetermination of dress. How she becomes symbolic in the idea of international terror and the barbaric Muslim in the midst. So she is seen as the victim of her families, the victim of her community, the victim of Islam, and needing, and to use Gayatri Spivak, who is another post-colonial feminist, in need of saving by the white and liberal democratic community. So somehow she needs to be rescued from her barbaric others. So there's this kind of ideological representation of the veil and the Muslim woman. So in wider discourse, she becomes both visible as the overdetermined, structured Muslim woman, but at the same time, she becomes largely invisible from policy discourse. So when we, in Britain, you know, we have, like you do here, high rates of domestic violence. In refuges, you know, there aren't particular refuges, or there are very few refuges for looking at Muslim women. In the schools, for example, there are national policies that look at Muslim pupils, and when we interviewed very senior policymakers about the Muslim pupils, he said, well, we really look at the boys, so pupils means boys, because they're the issue, and they brought in something called PVE, Prevention of Violence and Extremism. And when we had the bombings in London, we call 7/7, which was in July 2005, by homegrown second and third generation young Muslim men in Britain, when they bombed the underground and so on, they brought in this prevention of violence and extremist policy, which is actually to ask the schools to monitor young male behavior. This is from primary school, and report it to the authorities. And it's a whole program. And so he was talking about this program, saying we have to focus on males. And I said, well, what do you do for girls? And he said, well, we've got a bit on FGM, which is female genital mutilation, and a little bit looking at forced marriage and honor crimes. And therein lies the difference. You see, girls and boys are constructed very different. The boys are seen as potential terrorists, but the girls are seen as victims of their family, and very much structured around this issue of honor crimes in the barbaric Muslim community. So girls slipped through the policy agenda, and as I was saying about depression and mental health issues, there was very little that actually focused on them. So how do we take this then to the next level? Oh, did that go by itself? Did I flick that? So, did you have the other one with the mask on? Yes, you did. So how do then we work this through? Well, as you heard from Gillian, I am a black feminist. I've been one, this is like Alcoholics Anonymous, for the last 30 years. And I've been developing my thinking around black and post-colonial feminism using theoretical tools to understand research situations. And what black feminism is about is how do we look at the complexities of gender, race, and class, and how the boundaries between those become part of the material and symbolic and institutional structures that we live and work in. So how is a woman's difference or man's difference organized into social relations? So how does difference become part of our social relations and our political and economic structures? It doesn't happen by accident. How do we actually locate gender, race, and class in the wider political and social historical moments that it appears? Because how we looked at race, class, and gender 100 years ago is very different than now. It's constructed differently in different historical times, using different languages and different technologies of concealment and different social constructions of reality. So we talk about different groups in different times in different ways. Like I'm saying about how we talk about Muslims now as the new racialized other. Whereas before, it was very much looking at the black African post-slave society when we were looking at civil rights. So we now shifted to looking at Muslims. They run coterminously, because discourses are always partial and interwoven, but at the same time, there are different ways it manifests itself in different historical times. So we also need to understand how identity, how we see ourselves, becomes part of that. So how are we represented, and then how do we construct our subjectivity within these discourses that exist? Because we place ourselves in those discourses. We're not free from them. So the black feminist simply asks the question, and this comes from Gayatri Spivak, who is a black, she's an Indian post-colonial theorist from the USA, and she talks about that it's the work, how do I get rid of this? It's the work of the, how do I move this across? It's the work of the black and post-colonial feminist to simply ask the question, what does this mean? What does our looking at discourses, what do the 5 findings that I talked to you, what does it mean? And then to begin to plot a history, to begin to unravel the meaning behind it. And this is the process of knowledge production that activists engage in. And I use the notion of intersectionality to help me to evolve this knowledge framework to understand embodied difference, how difference becomes embodied as a Muslim young woman or as a young African American woman, or so on. So the strategic framework of intersectionality uses intersectionality, I'll just start at the very beginning, is a huge buzzword at the moment. Have you heard of intersectionality? Yeah, lots of people are nodding. It was very interesting because I've just published a new book and it went out to a reader who wasn't an academic herself. And she wrote back to me and she said, you've got a heading, intersectionality. I looked it up in the dictionary and it doesn't exist. Can you change it or take it out? And I said, no, it's a complex academic term and it's, you know, my livelihood depends on it. And so, you know, we live in different worlds. But intersectionality brings together race, class, and gender and other modes of disempowerment, like age, disability, sexuality, and so on. So it's complex. But just to focus on race, class, and gender, here's a very interesting quote from Prinz, who is a Swedish theorist around intersectionality. And she says that gender is always lived in the modalities of ethnicity and class. So you can't talk about gender without talking about where you're from and your class and your economic and social positioning. And you can't talk about nationality, being Canadian, without talking about gender and race, where your heritage, your history, where you're from, and so on. And you can't talk about class, your social economic positioning, or your status, and so on, without looking at gender and nationality. So they're all lived in the modalities of each other. They're interwoven. And it makes for complex analysis. And the reason that intersectionality evolved within, particularly within black feminism, is that we used to use what we call an additive model. We used to say which one was more important, a bit like, you know, a multi-layered cake with many layers, that, you know, race is more important, so it might be at the top, and then gender, and then we used to call it triple and double jeopardy. Do you remember those terms that we used to say, weigh it all up? Well, intersectionality has come in and kind of superseded that notion of having these multiple layers, and now we have a complex idea and understanding. And it looks a bit like this. Gerardo said to me, it looks like the British flag, and have you thought about that? But I like to think of it as the Champs-Élysées, you know, in Paris. You know, there's the Arc de Triomphe, and all the avenues are coming there together. This is my really sad attempt at PowerPoint using graphics, but anyway. So the idea of intersectionality came from somebody called Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor, and she used what we call this traffic light metaphor. And on the traffic light metaphor, you have avenues of disempowerment. So you have, like, sexuality is an avenue of inequality, discrimination, and disempowerment. And you have, so the young women, sexuality structures the regulation of their lives, and then gender, race, and class are all coterminous avenues of disempowerment. It's a highly structural model, this, and there are issues about having a very structural model, because there are sense in which, you know, how do we talk about agency if these avenues of disempowerment are so powerful? But what this model does, it aims to make visible the multiple positionings that constitute everyday life. So, for example, if you have a trafficked woman, and across Europe we have a lot of issues around trafficking, and I know that it's a universal issue. So would we say that a young trafficked woman, is it gender that really structures her life? The fact that she's a woman? Is it race and ethnicity? They often come from the Philippines or from Africa or from other disempowered, post-colonial poverty is one of the driving factors, social class. What would you say were the most important avenues of disempowerment in her life? A lot of the policy around trafficked women tends to see gender as the major issue, but the black feminists have said, well, actually, it is as much about race as it is about gender, where they're coming from, and the sort of location of disempowerment. Not all intersections are the same. Class can be a more structured driving inequality than maybe age or disability at any one time, because that can move and change, but class and gender and sexuality are more structured and located. So you can have different forms of inequalities. Now in this model, what happens in the center is that's where all the influences that structures the Muslim young woman or whoever, middle-class white women, it could be any group, or young African Caribbean students, which we have, young men. All these influences come, and at the start is where it meets, and there's the confluence or the structure of their identity. So they become their subjectivity, their identity, who they are, and where they find themselves in the social hierarchy is at that point of which all these influences meet. So that's why we call it intersectionality. I may be teaching you to suck eggs here, you may know this already. So I just wanted to make the point that, you know, race and class and gendered are an embodied, lived reality, and it happens at that confluence, how our subjectivity comes to be into being. And I'll explain how that, how am I doing for time? I forgot to look at my watch, I was so excited at being here. 5 minutes, oh my God. Intersecting and cross-cutting experiences of Muslim girls. Well, if we take that model, we have class as a driving issue. The women came largely from migrant populations. Now, Muslim women are a huge group. Some come from transnational global elites, very middle class, very well educated, and some are the poorest of the poor as refugees and asylum seekers without any kind of material wealth. So that class and transnational formations are really important in understanding how we located them. Nationality and migration, again, their ability to speak English and to so-called integrate, another issue that we need to talk about, is also quite important. The ease of which they used language, their mobility, issues around isolation. The young women, one of the key issues we found was that often through the process of migration, they left their families behind and they were isolated, and they often had to do all the care in the family. So that was a big issue. So that's how it structured their experience. Racial and racialization, there's a huge amount of stigma, not only being Muslim, but also being migrant. Again, being called a refugee or a migrant in the playground, in the school, is a dirty word. It was like how nigger was, 50 or even 30 years ago. Now refugee and asylum seekers is used to humiliate young people in the classroom, which is really interesting, and the racialization of migrants. And then religion, again, patriarchal restrictions, bodily restrictions on what females can and can't do, also part of the intersecting. And ethnicity and culture, the gendered roles and the expectations of young women, also the different cultures of Muslims, again, not a universal category. We had women from Iraq, Afghanistan, Burundi, Iran, Bangladesh, Pakistan. So we had so many different cultures, and so that was another intersecting area. And then sexuality and gender, again, high levels of regulation. And what happens also in the migrant process, I call it getting pickled in aspect, because you come from your country, but you stop evolving very often in terms of your adherence to your cultural values. They become stronger, they become more important. So, in fact, there is more regulation and rather than less. So, just very quickly, not only are we talking about intersectionality and how it builds identity, but also there are the wider discourses, some of which I talked about looking at the media, that structure intersectionality and Muslim women's experiences, and they're caught up in this. So, for example, they meet again at the confluence or the collision of all these discourses. We have multiculturalism and Islamophobia, two opposing yet united discourses. We could talk a bit more about that. I'm going to have to skip through that in terms of just looking at nationality and the national discourse around multiculturalism and Islamophobia. Then there's public and the private. Here the women were caught up, the young women, in the private family. You don't interfere with domestic issues. You don't get involved. If you do, you could be accused of interfering between man and wife, you know, the sacred family opposed to the state. And that was also the notion of honor and shame actually made that even more pronounced, because the value of honor, your personal integrity, what we call izzat, for the young women was very important, and they often wouldn't say when something was wrong, because that would be to humiliate and shame the family. And shame kept them as an ideology very much in check in terms of regulating their behavior. Also, there was the East and the West, colonialism and modernity, how they came together. Fear and risk, huge discourses of our time. Every time you're checked at the airport for security, it's about the huge discourse of security and order and fear and risk and terror. Then there's traditionalism and globalization, also around social change and transnationalism and globalization. And then patriarchy and religion. Well, you can't open the papers without hearing about issues to do with you know, the conflict between the imams, the new Islamic Middle Eastern governments, the Arab Spring. It's all within those discourses. But one of the things that I would like to say is that agency and subjectivity, we have all these discourses, the wider discourses, but agency and subjectivity is still very much part of the girls' and the young women's lives, because they're not simply objects of discourse, but they embody resistance. And I think that's something that we have to really talk about in our groups. How and why and do they resist these big, huge, wider discourses, the way that they're framed, the avenues of disempowerment and so on? Well, they do it through education, and education is seen as a way of social mobility. And I did some research. My original book, Young Female in Black, looked at the African Caribbean young women. And I found such a similarity between the two, because the African Caribbean young women really had a strong sense of credentialism. They really adhered to the notion of meritocracy, seeing, you know, passing exams and doing well as a way out of their social situations, as a form of social mobility. And I found this very much with the young women as well, this adherence to the ideology of meritocracy, changing their lives through the strategic rationalization of qualifications. They would choose what they could do, how they could do it. They might not get to be able to do the very best, you know. We have different qualifications in England, so I won't go into it, but they would use one as a stepping stone to get to another. They didn't often get straight into the top stream, but they would find their way through the system. So I think these are kind of new acts of citizenship and acts of refusal and refutation on their situation. And just finally to say, how do we then have active strategies, effective strategies for equity engagement as practitioners? Well, what we found is that we really need to challenge what I've called here intercultural dialogue. It's so, I hate that word. I find I struggle with it, because sometimes it can mean just learning about other people's cultures, almost in an anthropological way. Sometimes I've been asked to, you know, train police and nurses and so on, so that they shake the hand in the right way, or they don't give the wrong eye contact and offend them. That isn't intercultural dialogue. That isn't what we need. We need cultural understandings that go deeper to understanding the real issues. And we need to create safe spaces for practitioners to talk about these issues and find out more without feeling afraid of being accused of racism, or the whole correctness debate where whiteness becomes, if you like, the hurt party, where they feel they can't talk about the issues because then they'll be accused of racism. And so we need more CPD, continuous professional development, in order to look at the way we can really apply the very progressive legislation that you have here in Canada and that we have in the UK. It's not applied. We have instead evolved tick box institutional cultures where we can say we're doing the right thing. We call it performativity. We can perform it. We can say we have lots of diverse students and therefore we're a diverse institution. But actually, saying is not doing. You can say it, but not do it. And there's this kind of theoretical notion of performativity. You can perform it, but not actually apply it. And then secondly, we need clear procedures for dealing with incidents. As I was saying, the young women didn't say that they were actually depressed and so on. We need to look at safeguard their well-being. In England, we've got duties to safeguard. There's been a number of horrific child murders by parents and members of the family in the wider non-Muslim communities as well as Muslim communities. And they brought in this well-being agenda. But there still isn't inter-service cooperation, bringing the police, social workers, and counsellors together. They still struggle to do that. So we need clear procedures within the school and beyond. And then, most importantly, we need strong leadership for equality and social justice. What does this mean? Well, in one of the schools that was doing very well, she had evolved, the head had evolved an ethos for high expectations for all, for trust and respect between the students. And they had an inclusive school. They had children with disabilities and learning difficulties. So the young women helped and co-mentored and co-supervised their other pupils, their peers. So there was a whole feeling of the school as a community. So that was really important. And having high expectations for all, a whole school approach where it isn't just we need to target this failing group or that failing group. High expectations were expected of all pupils. And then finally, as I was saying earlier, one of the most important things that we found was why pupils didn't do well, and in your work with equity and social justice, is they didn't have the cultural capital of the middle classes. And learning mentors, these parent liaison officers or special mentors who were helping the young women apply for university, a lot of the girls never traveled out of their locality, so they would actually take them to universities. They'd never actually been in a seminar with men, and that was a big deal, and she would take them. She was a Muslim young woman who'd been to university herself, and she would work with them and introduce them slowly and gently to some of the ideas. She'd also talk to the parents about letting the girls leave home, because the parents would have very high expectations. They say, yeah, we've really got to go to university. We really want them to go to Oxford and Cambridge. And then when it came down to the crunch and they had to realize the girls were going to live away from home, they'd say no. And so there was this whole way in which they would have to work with the parents. But this providing of the social and cultural capital, networking, information gathering, these are things that the middle class take for granted and the working class haven't got access to. Okay, I'm just going to finish with a quote from the wonderful Paulo Freire. And for me, Paulo Freire sums up what activism is about. And he says here, to speak one word of truth is to transform the world. And I just love that. Even if you just remember that one thing, to speak the truth is to transform the world. That is to be honest to the research, to the work that you're doing. It can make such a huge difference. This is how we change the world. And he says here, the more radical the person is, the more fully or he and she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. So you need not only just to feel that you want to bring about equity and social justice, but you have to know it, and you have to know how you're going to analyze it. You have to interrogate it. You find ugly truths that you don't want to know, like, you know, the domestic violence issues in the Muslim community, but we have to name it, and then we have to develop it from there. And then he talks about this individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, and to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or enter into dialogue with them. That is very difficult, you know, not to be accused of racism or, you know, gender discrimination, to actually be brave about confronting issues. And then he goes on to say, this person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people or the liberator of the oppressed. You're not better than them. You're part of them. You're an instrument in social change. But he or she does commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side. So I leave you with that. Thank you.